In 1981, the Winchester Repeating Arms Factory in New Haven, Connecticut, closed forever. For over a century, this industrial giant had been unstoppable. At its peak, the complex employed tens of thousands, armed 2 world wars, and put a rifle in the hands of everyone from cowboys to cavalry. The gun that won the West. That's what they called it. But the family behind that fortune? They never got to enjoy it. Oliver Winchester died rich. His son William followed 4 months later. William's infant daughter died weeks after that. And his widow Sarah spent 38 years building a mansion to appease the ghosts of everyone those rifles killed. Stairs to nowhere, doors onto walls, a labyrinth of guilt. Today the factory is gone. The family is extinct. The mansion stands as a monument to blood money. So how does a dynasty built on death meet its own end? Oliver Fisher Winchester was not born into guns. He was born into poverty. Boston, 1810. His father was a farmer who died when Oliver was just a boy. By his teenage years, he was apprenticed to a carpenter, learning to measure twice and cut once. But Oliver had bigger ambitions than building furniture. He wanted to build a fortune. In 1848, at 38 years old, Winchester moved to New Haven, Connecticut, and started a shirt manufacturing business. This was the era when ready-made clothing was revolutionizing American retail. Before this, you made your own shirt or paid a tailor. Winchester saw the opportunity in mass production. He opened a factory, hired workers, and churned out men's dress shirts by the thousands. The business did well. By the mid-1850s, he was prosperous and comfortable. But comfortable wasn't enough. Not for Oliver Winchester. The opportunity came in 1855. Winchester invested in a struggling firearms company called the Volcanic Repeating Arms Company. Revolutionary concept, terrible execution. They were trying to build a repeating rifle, a gun that could fire multiple shots without reloading. The technology was promising. The ammunition was weak. The design was flawed. The company was bleeding money. Most investors would have walked away. Winchester bought more shares. By 1857, Volcanic was bankrupt. Winchester swooped in, purchased the remaining assets for pennies on the dollar, and reorganized everything. He hired a brilliant gunsmith named Benjamin Tyler Henry. Gave him one instruction: fix it. Make it work. Make it deadly. Henry did exactly that. He redesigned the rifle from the ground up. New lever action mechanism. Faster, more reliable, more powerful than anything else on the market. The ammunition was completely reimagined. Instead of weak volcanic rounds, Henry developed a brass cartridge that packed serious firepower. The result was the Henry rifle, patented in 1860. It could fire 16 shots without reloading. Let that sink in. In an era when most soldiers carried single-shot muskets, this was a quantum leap in killing technology. The timing could not have been better, or worse, depending on how you look at it. April 1861. Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. The American Civil War began. Suddenly, the United States government needed weapons. Lots of weapons. Fast. Oliver Winchester had exactly what they wanted. The Union Army placed orders for Henry rifles. Winchester's factory ramped up production. The rifle earned a fearsome reputation. Confederate soldiers called it that damned Yankee rifle that they load on Sunday and shoot all week. Hyperbole, but not by much. A skilled shooter could fire 28 rounds per minute. A soldier with a standard musket was lucky to manage 3. But here's the thing about war. It ends. When the Civil War concluded in 1865, Winchester faced a problem. He had built a factory geared for military production. Suddenly, the military wasn't buying. He needed new customers. He found them out west. The American frontier in the late 1860s was violent, lawless, and expanding fast. Settlers pushing into Native American territories, railroads stretching across the plains, outlaws, bandits, and cattle rustlers everywhere. Everyone needed a gun. In 1866, Winchester improved on the Henry design and released the Winchester Model 1866. They called it the Yellow Boy because of its brass receiver, lighter, more reliable, easier to reload. Winchester marketed it aggressively to settlers, ranchers, railroad workers, anyone heading west with dreams of land and gold. The marketing worked, but Winchester wasn't satisfied. He kept pushing his engineers, more powerful, more accurate, more deadly. In 1873, they delivered the masterpiece, the Winchester Model. 1873 became the most famous rifle in American history. More powerful cartridge, accurate at longer ranges, tough enough to survive frontier conditions. Cowboys carried it, lawmen used it, outlaws used it, and the United States Army used it to fight the Indian Wars. Think about that for a second. The same rifle a rancher might use to protect cattle from wolves was also being used by the 7th Cavalry at the Little Bighorn. Winchester didn't care who pulled the trigger, as long as they bought the gun first. The company called it the gun that won the West. What they didn't mention was what the West was being won from. Native American tribes pushed off ancestral lands, massacred in campaigns of systematic violence. Winchester rifles were the tools of that dispossession. Every trigger pull was another step in the erasure of indigenous peoples. But back in New Haven, none of that mattered. The money was flowing in faster than Oliver could count it. The factory expanded. More land, more buildings, more workers. By the late 1870s, the New Haven complex was one of the largest firearms manufacturing operations in the world. Thousands of employees, rifles shipping to every corner of the globe. Oliver Winchester had transformed himself from shirt maker into arms dealer, from carpenter's apprentice into one of the richest men in America. He had built an empire on gunpowder and lead. Then, in December 1880, Oliver Winchester died, 70 years old, worn out from decades of relentless work. His obituaries praised him as a captain of industry, a self-made man who embodied the American dream. They didn't mention the bodies. They never do. Oliver's son William inherited the company. He was 40 years old, educated, refined, and completely unprepared for what was coming. He had worked in his father's shadow for years. Now the shadow was gone. William never got the chance to step into the light. He had tuberculosis. In the 1880s, there was no cure. The disease ate his lungs, leaving him weaker by the day. 4 months after Oliver's death, in March 1881, William Winchester died, 40 years old. The Winchester Empire had lost 2 leaders in 4 months, but the tragedy wasn't finished. William and his wife Sarah had 1 child, a daughter named Annie, born in 1866, but Annie was sickly from birth. She suffered from marasmus, a wasting disease that prevented proper nutrient absorption. She was starving no matter how much she ate. Annie Winchester died just weeks after her birth. Never saw her first birthday. Sarah Winchester was now alone, her daughter dead, her husband dead, her father-in-law dead. And she was left holding a fortune built on instruments of death, $20 million in inheritance, $1,000 a day in royalties. Every time someone bought a Winchester, Sarah got richer. Every time someone pulled the trigger, more money flowed into her accounts. She was 39 years old, childless, widowed, drowning in blood money. The question that would define her life was simple. What do you do with a fortune you can never escape? The grief that consumed Sarah Winchester after 1881 was not ordinary mourning. It was something darker, more obsessive, edged with guilt that had no logical outlet. She had lost everything that mattered in the span of a few months. Her infant daughter, her husband, her purpose. What remained was money, endless, relentless money that kept pouring in whether she wanted it or not. Sarah withdrew from society, stopped attending social functions, rarely left her home. Friends who tried to visit were turned away. The vibrant young woman who had married William Winchester in 1862 seemed to have died alongside him. What remained was a ghost in black mourning clothes, drifting through empty rooms, unable to escape the weight of what her family had created. Back in New Haven, the factory hummed along without any Winchester at the helm. Professional managers kept the production lines running. The rifles kept shipping. The money kept accumulating. By the early 1880s, Winchester Repeating Arms was producing over 200,000 firearms per year. The company had expanded far beyond the original Henry rifle: shotguns, carbines, ammunition, accessories, contracts with foreign governments, weapons shipping to conflicts around the world. The sun never set on Winchester products. The New Haven factory complex had become a city within a city. The main facility sprawled across blocks of industrial land near the harbor, a maze of brick buildings and smokestacks that dominated the skyline. Inside, thousands of workers toiled on the production lines. Picture this: machinists shaping metal barrels on precision lathes, woodworkers carving rifle stocks from walnut and maple, assembly workers fitting hundreds of tiny components together with practiced efficiency, quality inspectors testing each weapon before shipment, ensuring every Winchester would fire true. The workforce was a cross-section of immigrant America: Irish fleeing the famine, Italians seeking opportunity, Germans with machining skills, Poles, Czechs, Hungarians. They came to New Haven because Winchester was hiring, and Winchester was always hiring. The company paid decent wages for the era. Though decent is a relative term, a skilled machinist might earn $2 a day, an unskilled laborer half that. Women and children worked lighter assembly tasks for even less. The conditions inside were brutal by modern standards: 10-hour shifts, 12 hours during peak production, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. The air thick with metal dust and gun oil, the noise deafening. A constant roar of machinery, hammering, and grinding that left workers with permanent hearing damage. Safety equipment was minimal. Guards on machines often removed to speed production, fingers lost, hands crushed, eyes damaged by flying metal shards. When a worker was injured, they were replaced. There was always someone waiting at the gate. But for workers who survived and stayed, Winchester employment meant stability. It meant a steady paycheck when work was often seasonal or unreliable. Entire neighborhoods grew up around the factory. Fathers worked the lines, then their sons joined them. Generations tied their fortunes to the company. The city and the corporation became inseparable. Meanwhile, across the country, the rifles kept doing their work. In the Southwest, the Army used Winchesters to subdue the Apache. In the northern plains, they were weapons of choice against the Sioux and Cheyenne. Wounded Knee, the Nez Perce War, the Red River War. Every conflict that pushed Native Americans from their lands was fought with Winchester repeating rifles. The gun that won the West was really the gun that cleared it of the people who had lived there for thousands of years. But the rifles didn't discriminate. They were tools. And tools serve whoever holds them. Outlaws carried Winchesters when they robbed stagecoaches and trains. Billy the Kid reportedly owned several. The Dalton gang used them. So did the James brothers. Lawmen carried the same weapons to hunt those outlaws down. Wyatt Earp was a Winchester man. So was Pat Garrett, the man who killed Billy the Kid. The same rifle that murdered was also the rifle that delivered justice. Winchester profited either way. Internationally, the company was even less particular. Winchester rifles shipped to South America, arming revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries alike. To Africa, where European colonial powers used them to subjugate indigenous populations. To Asia, to the Middle East. Anywhere there was conflict and money to be made. Every bullet that left a Winchester barrel added to the family fortune. Every death put more money in Sarah Winchester's accounts. She knew this. That was the unbearable part. Sarah Winchester was not stupid. She could read the newspapers. She understood in a way her husband and father-in-law had perhaps chosen not to understand, that her wealth was built on corpses. Every silk dress paid for in blood. Every meal seasoned with death. The Winchester fortune was a curse disguised as a blessing. According to legend, Sarah sought help from the spirit world. The story goes that she consulted a medium in Boston, hoping to contact her dead husband and daughter. What she got instead was a warning. The medium supposedly told her the Winchester family was haunted by the spirits of everyone killed by Winchester rifles. Thousands of ghosts. Tens of thousands. Maybe hundreds of thousands. All of them angry. All of them hungry for revenge. The only way to appease them, the medium said, was to build. Build a house for the spirits. Build continuously. Build forever. As long as construction continued, the ghosts would be placated. The moment it stopped, Sarah would die. Now let's be clear. There's no historical evidence this seance ever happened. The story first appeared in newspaper articles years after Sarah's death, embellished by journalists looking for sensational angles. What we know for certain is this. Sarah Winchester left New Haven in 1884 and headed west to California. She bought an 8-room farmhouse in San Jose on 44 acres. And then she started building. What happened next defies rational explanation. Sarah hired carpenters, a lot of them. Then she started giving instructions. Add a room here, extend a hallway there, build another staircase, no, build 2 more. The workers did as they were told. The money was good, the work was steady, they didn't ask questions, they just built. And they kept building. The construction ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. 3 shifts of workers rotating around the clock. The sound of hammers and saws never stopped. New rooms added, then connected by strange hallways that seemed to go nowhere. Staircases built that climbed directly into the ceiling. Doors installed that opened onto blank walls. Windows that looked into other rooms instead of outside. The architecture made no sense, because it wasn't supposed to make sense. Sarah wasn't building a house. She was building a maze. Consider the staircases. The house eventually contained 40 of them, but many served no functional purpose. One famous staircase has 44 steps that rise only 9 feet. Each step just 2 inches tall. Walking up takes forever, but gets you almost nowhere. Another descends 7 steps, then rises 11, and ending exactly where it started. Still others climb dutifully upward only to terminate at a ceiling. No door, no hatch, no way through. Dead ends masquerading as passages. The doors were equally perverse. The house contained over 2,000 of them, but many opened onto blank walls. Others led to 10-foot drops onto the garden below. One door on the 2nd floor opens to nothing, just empty air and a long fall. Cabinet doors concealed not shelves, but passages into other rooms. A door in the floor might lead to a room below, or might lead nowhere at all. Navigating the house required memorizing which doors were real and which were elaborate traps for spirits. Windows followed the same chaotic logic. Some looked into other rooms rather than outside. Some were installed in interior walls, letting occupants spy on adjacent spaces. One window was set into the floor, looking down into the room below. Skylights placed in floors. Stained glass windows depicting spider webs scattered throughout. Sarah believed spiders were good omens. The number 13 appeared obsessively. 13 hooks in the seance room. 13 panes in certain windows. 13 steps on some staircases. Sarah seemed convinced the number held protective power. The house sprawled outward and upward simultaneously. At its peak, it reached 7 stories tall, with an estimated 600 rooms, though the exact count was impossible because Sarah kept adding, subtracting, and reconfiguring spaces. Entire wings built, used briefly, then sealed off and abandoned. Hallways looped back on themselves. Rooms opened into other rooms that opened into still more rooms. An endless regression of Victorian excess. Sarah lived in this labyrinth like a spider in its web. She employed a staff of servants who had to learn the house's secrets to navigate it. Private gardener, cook, housekeeper, numerous attendants, all paid handsomely to tolerate her eccentricities. She rarely left the property. When she ventured into San Jose, she traveled in a private carriage with curtains drawn. She avoided photographs, refused visitors. The richest woman in California lived like a hermit in a mansion designed for ghosts. Every night, according to legend, Sarah descended to a special séance room at the heart of the house. This blue room was accessible only through deliberately confusing passages meant to disorient evil spirits. Inside, she would commune with the dead, receiving instructions for the next day's construction. What rooms to build, what passages to seal, what new architectural impossibilities to create. The ghosts dictated. Sarah obeyed. But here's the thing about the séance story. There's no proof it happened the way legends claim. No first-hand accounts of Sarah's spiritual practices. No diaries describing conversations with the dead. The tales come from servants' gossip, journalists' speculation, and promotional materials for the tourist attraction the house later became. What we know for certain is that Sarah Winchester built compulsively for 38 years. Why she built is open to interpretation. Some historians argue the supernatural explanation is pure fiction, invented to make the house more marketable after Sarah's death. They point out she never spoke publicly about ghosts or curses. She may simply have been a wealthy or eccentric widow who found purpose in construction. Building gave her something to do. It employed workers who depended on her. It allowed her to exercise control over something in a life shattered by losses beyond her control. The house wasn't a monument to guilt. It was a monument to grief, finding an outlet. Others see more complexity. Sarah was educated, intelligent, from a family that valued rational thought. She wasn't a credulous fool, but she had lost everyone she loved and inherited a fortune she may have viewed as cursed. Perhaps building was penance, a way of giving back some of what her family had taken. The money that built the house might otherwise have sat in bank accounts, accumulating more interest from rifle sales. By spending it on construction, Sarah employed carpenters, bricklayers, craftsmen. She circulated blood money back into the economy, transformed death into wages, or perhaps she was simply losing her mind. Grief does that sometimes. It erodes sanity slowly, replaces logic with obsession, reason with ritual. If Sarah believed the ghosts were real, then her building made perfect sense. She was protecting herself the only way she knew how. The fact that the protection was irrational didn't matter. Irrational threats demand irrational responses. She built against the darkness because building was all she had left. The spending was astronomical. In an era when a decent house cost a few $1,000s, Sarah spent over $1,000 a day on construction alone. Adjusted for inflation, roughly $30,000 daily. Millions per year poured into a house that grew like a tumor and spreading across the California landscape in a sprawl of Victorian excess. Meanwhile, the rifles that funded this madness kept doing their work. Spanish-American War, Philippine insurrection, labor disputes put down at gunpoint, bank robberies, lynchings, self-defense, murder. Every trigger pull added to the ledger, and Sarah Winchester's fortune kept growing whether she wanted it to or not. The factory floor at Winchester Repeating Arms was a world unto itself, governed by its own brutal physics. Step inside, and you entered a realm of noise, heat, metal, and motion that never stopped. The machinery ran from dawn until dark, then ran through the night under electric lights that buzzed and flickered. The air tasted of oil and iron filings. The floor vibrated beneath your feet with the rhythm of 1,000 machines pounding in mechanical unison. The workers who labored here understood something the executives in their offices chose not to see. Every rifle that left this factory was built to kill. That was its purpose. Its only purpose. The elegant walnut stocks and gleaming blued barrels were not decorative. They were functional elements of a killing instrument, designed with care and precision to end human lives efficiently. The workers' hands shaped death into its final form. 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, year after year. The barrel department was where raw steel became lethal. Workers fed steel billets into drilling machines that bored holes through their centers with terrifying precision. Tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Too loose, and the rifle would be inaccurate. Too tight, and it might explode in the shooter's hands. The machinists worked in a constant fog of cutting oil and metal dust. It coated their skin, clogged their lungs, shortened their lives. They knew this. They worked anyway. The rifling machines were marvels of industrial engineering. They cut spiral grooves into barrel interiors that would spin bullets as they fired, giving them gyroscopic stability for accurate flight over long distances. The workers who operated these machines required years of training, aristocrats of the factory floor, top wages, commanding respect. But even they breathed the same poisoned air, faced the same dangers, lived under the same shadow of industrial mortality. Heat treatment was especially hazardous. Barrels had to be hardened through carefully controlled heating and cooling cycles. Workers manipulated white-hot metal with long tongs, moving pieces from furnaces to quenching baths. Temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees. Burns were inevitable. Sometimes the metal shattered during quenching, sending shrapnel flying. A man could lose an eye in seconds. Many did. The stock shop was quieter, but carried its own dangers. Craftsmen shaped walnut and maple into graceful curves of rifle furniture, working with hand tools and power planers that could take off a finger before you felt the pain. Sawdust filled the air, fine particulate that settled in lungs and caused chronic respiratory disease. The lacquers and finishes contained solvents that damaged livers, kidneys, and nervous systems over decades of exposure. Workers in the stock shop aged prematurely, bodies broken down by chemicals nobody thought to protect them from. The assembly lines brought all components together. Workers with practiced hands fitted dozens of tiny parts into receivers, aligned triggers and hammers, tested actions for smoothness and reliability. The work required intense concentration. A misaligned part could cause a malfunction. A malfunction could cause a death, either of the user or someone standing nearby when the weapon failed. Quality control was paramount. Inspection regimes rejected imperfect work ruthlessly. Workers who made too many mistakes were fired. There was always someone willing to take their place. Throughout the factory, children worked alongside adults. Boys as young as 10 swept floors, carried materials, performed light assembly tasks. Girls sorted small parts and packaged ammunition. Child labor laws existed but were weakly enforced. Factory managers argued children needed to learn trades early, that keeping them in school was impractical for working families, that their small hands were actually better suited to delicate tasks. The real reason was simpler. Children cost less. Wages varied by skill, ethnicity, and gender. A skilled white machinist might earn $2 or more per day. An immigrant laborer earned half that. Women earned less than men for identical work. Black workers, in rare cases when hired at all, were relegated to the most dangerous and lowest-paying jobs. The factory replicated American society's hierarchies in miniature, enforced them through pay scales and job assignments. Yet despite the exploitation, the danger, the grinding nature of the work, Winchester employees often expressed strange loyalty to the company. Part was practical. Steady work was rare. A man with a Winchester job could feed his family. In an era before unemployment insurance or social safety nets, that mattered more than working conditions. Part was cultural. Winchester workers took pride in their craft. They were building the finest rifles in the world, weapons that cowboys and presidents and adventurers trusted with their lives. That meant something. The company cultivated this loyalty deliberately, organized baseball teams and social clubs, threw company picnics, built housing for workers, offered small loans to employees facing hardship. These paternalistic gestures created bonds of obligation that made labor organizing difficult. Workers who owed their homes to the company were unlikely to bite the hand that held their mortgages. But the paternalism had limits. When workers pushed too hard for better conditions or higher wages, management pushed back harder. Strike threats met with replacement workers from other cities. Labor organizers identified and blacklisted. The message was clear. Winchester provided, but Winchester also controlled. Accept the deal or find another job. Meanwhile, the products of all this labor spread across the globe. Winchester rifles armed the Rough Riders charging up San Juan Hill in 1898. They equipped Philippine scouts during the Philippine-American War, a brutal counterinsurgency that killed hundreds of thousands of Filipinos, a conflict history has largely forgotten. They went to China during the Boxer Rebellion, to South Africa during the Boer War, to Mexico during the Revolution. Anywhere men were killing each other, Winchester supplied the tools. The company maintained studied neutrality about how their products were used. They sold to governments and rebels, lawmen and criminals, settlers and the armies that hunted those settlers' neighbors. Morality was not their concern. Sales were their concern. Every trigger pull was a future customer needing more ammunition. Every war was a business opportunity. In San Jose, Sarah Winchester kept building, room after room, hallway after hallway, staircase after staircase. The house had become something beyond architecture, a physical manifestation of grief and guilt that grew like a cancer, consuming land and money and purpose. And back in New Haven, the factory kept churning out rifles. The same money, the same blood. The curse Sarah tried to build her way out of was not supernatural. It was economic, industrial, baked into the very nature of what the Winchester family had created. You cannot build a fortune on death and expect it not to follow you home. In the summer of 1914, a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip fired 2 shots in Sarajevo. Those shots killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife Sophie. Within weeks, the great powers of Europe were mobilizing for war. By August, the continent was ablaze. And in New Haven, Connecticut, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company was about to experience the greatest boom in its history. The First World War was unlike any conflict humanity had ever seen. Industrial nations threw their entire economies into the machinery of death. Factories that had made consumer goods converted to military production. Millions of young men conscripted, armed, and fed into trenches where they died by the hundreds of thousands. The demand for weapons was insatiable. Every army needed rifles. Every rifle needed ammunition. Winchester was ready to deliver. The company had been preparing for this moment, even if they didn't know it. The New Haven factory complex had been expanded and modernized throughout the early 1900s. New buildings constructed, new machinery installed, workforce grown to over 10,000 employees. When war orders started arriving from European governments, Winchester was positioned to fulfill them. The British Army placed massive orders. The French did the same. The Russian Empire, desperately short of modern weapons for its vast conscript army, bought everything Winchester could ship. The company ran 3 shifts around the clock, hired thousands of additional workers, expanded again, building new facilities dedicated solely to military production. By 1916, Winchester was producing over 250,000 rifles per year, tens of millions of rounds of ammunition. The profits were staggering. Revenue that had been measured in millions suddenly measured in tens of millions. Dividends flowed to shareholders like water from a burst dam. Stock prices soared. Winchester executives became some of the wealthiest men in Connecticut. They built mansions, endowed charities, congratulated themselves on their patriotic contribution to the Allied cause. But the workers who actually built the weapons saw little of this windfall. Wages rose slightly, but not in proportion to profits. Hours remained brutal. Conditions remained dangerous. The influx of inexperienced workers led to more accidents on the factory floor. Management pushed for faster production, cut corners on safety to meet insatiable demand. The workers who complained were reminded that the boys in the trenches needed those rifles. Patriotism was weaponized to suppress dissent. The war finally ended in November 1918. The guns fell silent on the Western Front. Millions lay dead. And Winchester Repeating Arms faced a problem it should have anticipated, but somehow hadn't. What do you do when the war is over? Military contracts evaporated almost overnight. Governments that had been ordering rifles by the 100,000 suddenly had warehouses full of surplus weapons. They weren't buying anymore. The civilian market was flooded. Returning soldiers brought service rifles home. Surplus military weapons sold cheaply to the public. Everyone who wanted a gun already had one, often several. Winchester's revenue collapsed. The workforce that had swelled to 15,000 during war years was slashed. Layoffs hit New Haven like a plague. Families who had relocated for factory jobs found themselves unemployed in a strange city. No savings, no prospects. The boom had become a bust almost overnight. The company scrambled to diversify. Sporting goods, fishing tackle, flashlights, household hardware, Winchester brand roller skates, Winchester kitchen knives, Winchester baseball bats. The logic was simple. The brand was famous. People trusted Winchester. They would buy anything with the name on it. But consumers weren't stupid. They knew Winchester made guns, not kitchen knives. The diversification efforts largely failed, draining capital without generating sustainable revenue. Meanwhile, in San Jose, Sarah Winchester was dying. She was 82 years old in 1922. Her health had been failing for years. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake had damaged her house badly, collapsing the top 3 stories and trapping her in her bedroom until servants could dig her out. She never fully recovered. She continued building, but more slowly. The seances continued, but she seemed tired, worn out by decades of trying to appease the dead. On September 5, 1922, Sarah Winchester died in her sleep. The hammers that had pounded 24 hours a day for 38 years finally fell silent. Workers who arrived that morning were told to put down their tools and go home. The house that Sarah had built to confuse the spirits was finally, irrevocably complete. Except it wasn't complete. It was never meant to be complete. The house was a process, not a product. With Sarah gone, it just stopped. Construction materials sat where they had been left. Rooms remained half-finished. The maze froze in mid-expansion like a tumor caught in a CT scan, sprawling and malignant and suddenly still. Sarah's estate was valued at millions, but the house itself was nearly worthless. Who would buy such a monstrosity? Who could even maintain it? The heirs sold off furniture and personal effects in an auction that took weeks. The house itself sold for a fraction of what Sarah had spent building it. Eventually, it opened to the public as a tourist attraction, the Winchester Mystery House, a monument to madness that drew visitors from around the world. Back in New Haven, the company Sarah's fortune had built was struggling to survive. The 1920s were difficult. Competition had intensified. Other manufacturers, American and foreign, produced quality firearms at lower prices. The sporting goods diversification had failed. Military contracts remained minimal as the world embraced brief, naive hope for permanent peace. The company that had once dominated American firearms was now just another player fighting for market share. Labor relations deteriorated. Workers who had accepted wartime demands pushed back against peacetime wages and conditions. Strikes threatened production. Union organizers gained footholds. Management responded with usual tactics: replacement workers, blacklists, company spies infiltrating union meetings. The paternalistic relationship that had kept workers loyal for decades was breaking down. Then came 1929. The stock market crash that October triggered the worst economic depression in American history. Banks failed. Businesses collapsed. Unemployment soared to 25% nationally. For Winchester, already weakened by years of declining sales, the depression was nearly fatal. The workforce slashed to a skeleton crew. The factory that had employed 15,000 during World War I now employed fewer than 2,000. Entire buildings sat empty, machinery idle, floors gathering dust. The company posted losses year after year. Creditors circled. Bankruptcy seemed inevitable. The community that had grown up around Winchester suffered terribly. Generations of New Haven families had depended on factory wages. Now those wages were gone. Homes foreclosed. Families broke apart. Young men who had expected to follow their fathers into the factory found themselves with no future at all. Some left for other cities. Some joined the growing ranks of homeless wandering the country. Some simply gave up. Winchester limped through the Depression years, surviving through cost-cutting government contracts for law enforcement weapons and sheer stubbornness. The company that had armed the conquest of the West and the trenches of France clung to existence by its fingernails, waiting for something to change, waiting for another war. The war they were waiting for came on December 7, 1941. Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. America was dragged into the Second World War. For Winchester Repeating Arms, it was 1914 all over again. The machinery of death needed feeding. Winchester was ready to serve. The company pivoted to military production with practiced efficiency. They had done this before. They knew the drill. Within months, idle factories were roaring back to life. Workers who had been laid off for years returned to production lines. New workers flooded in from across New England, drawn by steady wages and the promise of contributing to the war effort. The workforce that had shrunk to a few thousand during the Depression swelled back toward wartime highs. Winchester produced the M1 Garand rifle, the standard infantry weapon of the American military. They manufactured carbines by the hundreds of thousands, churned out ammunition at rates that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The factory became a temple of industrial production, consecrated to the defeat of fascism. Once again, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. With men shipping overseas to fight, factories needed bodies for production lines. Women who had never worked outside the home learned to operate lathes, assemble rifle components, inspect finished weapons. They proved themselves capable and essential, demolishing assumptions about what women could and couldn't do. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda, she was reality. The money poured in again. Government contracts guaranteed profits. The company was essentially a public utility now, an arm of the war machine that functioned regardless of market conditions. Winchester executives knew this couldn't last forever, but they also knew it would last long enough to matter. Every year of wartime production rebuilt reserves depleted during lean years. The war ended in 1945, first in Europe, then in the Pacific. American industrial might had proven decisive. The arsenal of democracy had outproduced every enemy, and once again, Winchester faced the aftermath. This time they thought they were prepared. Management had learned lessons from the post-World War I collapse. They wouldn't make the same mistakes. They would manage the transition carefully, diversify intelligently, maintain market position while adjusting to peacetime demand. They had a plan. The plan failed. The problem was competition. During war years, other manufacturers had expanded their capabilities. Companies that had never made firearms before had tooled up for military production, and they weren't going away. Foreign manufacturers, particularly from Japan and Germany, were rebuilding their industries, targeting the American market with cheaper products. Winchester faced more competitors than ever before, all of them hungry. The company also faced a changing market. The generation returning from war was different. They had seen enough killing. Many veterans wanted nothing to do with firearms. They weren't interested in hunting rifles or shotguns. They wanted to forget. The nostalgic image of the Winchester rifle, the gun that won the West, meant nothing to young men who had seen friends die holding similar weapons. Cultural shifts compounded the problem. America was becoming suburban, urban, disconnected from rural and frontier traditions that had made Winchester legendary. Fewer Americans hunted. Fewer lived in places where a rifle was practical necessity. The core customer base was aging and shrinking. Winchester tried to adapt, modernize designs. New models meant to appeal to contemporary tastes, invested in advertising, trying to make their brand relevant to new generations, continued diversifying, acquiring companies in related industries, hoping to spread risk. None of it worked as well as they needed. The family that had built the company was long gone. No Winchester had been involved in management since William's death in 1881. Professional managers and outside shareholders controlled the corporation, decisions made by executives whose primary loyalty was to quarterly earnings, not legacy or tradition. When cuts needed to be made, they made them without sentiment. The 1960s and 1970s brought more trouble, labor costs rising, environmental regulations, finally enacted after decades of industrial pollution, required expensive remediation. The New Haven factory, which had been dumping waste for nearly a century, faced cleanup requirements costing millions. Every mandate cut into profits. Every regulation made American manufacturing less competitive. Foreign competition intensified. Japanese manufacturers, particularly, produced reliable firearms at prices Winchester couldn't match. Lower labor costs, newer, more efficient factories, no burden of century-old facilities and accumulated costs of industrial legacy. Winchester tried to compete on quality and reputation. But reputation only goes so far when the price gap is wide enough. The company changed hands multiple times. Investors bought it, stripped what value they could, and sold it on. Each transition brought new management, new strategies, new promises that this time would be different. Each time, the fundamental problems remained unsolved. The market was shrinking. Competition was fierce. Costs were too high. By the 1980s, the New Haven factory operated at a fraction of its capacity. Buildings that had housed thousands of workers stood empty. Production lines that had run around the clock now operated single shifts with skeleton crews. The machinery was aging, facilities obsolete. Investing in modernization would cost more than the company could afford. Not investing meant slow decay. In 2006, the inevitable finally happened. Winchester Repeating Arms filed for bankruptcy. The company that had armed the winning of the West, supplied 2 world wars, and defined American firearms manufacturing for over a century, was finished. The factory in New Haven closed permanently. The workers, those few who remained, were laid off for the final time. But the Winchester brand didn't disappear. Brands rarely do in modern capitalism. The name was purchased by Olin Corporation, a diversified industrial company that saw value in the historic trademark. They licensed the Winchester name to various manufacturers who produced firearms overseas. Today, you can still buy a Winchester rifle. It's made in Japan or Belgium or Portugal. The guns are fine products. They have nothing to do with New Haven. The ghost of Winchester lives on in marketing departments and licensing agreements. Well, the name still sells, the legend still resonates, but the substance behind that name? The factories, the workers, the community that built real products with real hands, gone. What remains is a brand detached from any manufacturing reality, a signifier without a referent, a ghost wearing the skin of what used to be an empire. The gun that won the West couldn't save itself. Today, if you visit New Haven, Connecticut, you can still find traces of the Winchester Empire. The old factory complex has been repurposed. Some buildings house apartments and offices. Others converted into retail spaces and restaurants. A few stand empty, awaiting demolition or renovation. The smokestacks that once belched soot across the city are gone. The constant roar of machinery that defined neighborhoods for a century has fallen silent. But the legacy isn't just architectural. The environmental damage Winchester left behind took decades to address. Billions of dollars to remediate. The soil around the old factory site was saturated with lead, cadmium, and other heavy metals from a century of industrial operations. Groundwater contamination spread beyond factory boundaries, affecting residential neighborhoods where workers and their families had lived for generations. Cleanup efforts continue to this day. Some contamination may never be fully addressed. The human cost is harder to quantify. Generations of workers exposed to toxic substances without protection or warning. Lead poisoning. Respiratory disease. Industrial accidents. Lives claimed and lifespans shortened that will never appear in any corporate ledger. The workers who built the Winchester fortune received wages, yes, but they also received poison. They traded their health for paychecks, often without knowing the true price they were paying. The community that grew up around Winchester had to reinvent itself completely. New Haven was a company town in all but name, its economy tied to the factory's fortunes. When Winchester declined, the city declined with it. Crime increased. Property values collapsed. Families that had lived in the same neighborhoods for generations moved away or fell into poverty. The social fabric that Winchester employment had helped weave came apart thread by thread. The revitalization took decades. It's still incomplete. New Haven has rebuilt itself around Yale University and the healthcare sector, creating new economic engines to replace the one that died. But the scars remain. Neighborhoods that once housed factory workers are now gentrified or abandoned, depending on which side of the tracks you're standing on. The prosperity is unevenly distributed. The memory of what was lost lingers. 3,000 miles away, in San Jose, California, the Winchester Mystery House still stands. It's a tourist attraction now, and one of the most popular in the Bay Area. Visitors pay admission to walk through bizarre hallways, climbing stairs that lead nowhere, opening doors onto walls, marveling at architectural madness that Sarah Winchester created over 38 years of continuous construction. The house has been commercialized ruthlessly, gift shops selling Winchester-branded merchandise, flashlight tours, Halloween events, escape rooms built in outbuildings on the property. The genuine grief and possible mental illness that drove Sarah's construction has been transformed into entertainment, a spooky backstory that adds value to the admission price. The tour guides tell the ghost story because the ghost story sells tickets. They talk about seances and spirits and the curse that supposedly drove Sarah to build forever. They show visitors the blue room where she allegedly communicated with the dead. Point out the number 13 appearing throughout the house. It's a good story. It's probably not true. At least not the way they tell it. What's more likely true is simpler and sadder. Sarah Winchester was a woman who lost everything that mattered and found herself holding a fortune she couldn't escape. She was intelligent enough to understand where that money came from, sensitive enough to feel the weight of it, wealthy enough to do whatever she wanted with the rest of her life. What she wanted, apparently, was to build. Maybe she believed in ghosts. Maybe she was trying to stay busy, fill the void, transform blood money into employment for carpenters and wages for craftsmen. Maybe building was therapy, maybe penance, maybe madness. We'll never know for certain because Sarah didn't explain herself. She left no memoir, no diary that's been made public, no definitive statement of intentions. The house speaks for her in its wordless, irrational language of stairs and doors and windows and rooms. It says something about guilt, about grief, about what happens when you have unlimited resources and unlimited time and nothing left to lose. What exactly it says remains open to interpretation. So what can we learn from the rise and fall of Winchester Repeating Arms? From the strange, sad story of the family behind it? Lesson 1. Every fortune has a cost. Oliver Winchester built his empire by manufacturing instruments of death. He did it brilliantly. Innovation, marketing genius, ruthless business acumen. But the product was what it was. Rifles kill people. That's their purpose. The Winchester family got rich because their rifles killed people more efficiently than the competition. Sarah understood this in a way Oliver and William apparently didn't, or chose not to. The money was cursed because it came from a cursed source, not supernaturally cursed, morally cursed, every dollar paid for in blood. Lesson 2. Markets change, and companies that don't change with them die. Winchester dominated the firearms industry for decades, but they failed to adapt when conditions shifted. After each war, caught flat-footed by peacetime markets, diversified clumsily into products they didn't understand, let foreign competitors undercut them on price, while resting on reputation that meant less each passing year. The company that had won the West couldn't figure out how to win the suburbs. Lesson 3. Corporations extract and communities pay. Winchester took everything it could from New Haven: labor, loyalty, health, environment. The company profited enormously. The community benefited somewhat while the factory ran. But when the factory closed, Winchester walked away. The pollution stayed, the unemployment stayed, the broken families and diminished opportunities stayed. The corporation moved on or ceased to exist. The community had to live with what was left behind. Lesson 4. Legacy is not just what you build, but what you leave. The Winchester legacy includes the rifles, yes, the innovations in manufacturing and marketing, but it also includes contaminated soil, poisoned workers, abandoned community, and the strange mansion in San Jose where a grieving widow tried to build her way out of guilt. A legacy is comprehensive. It includes consequences you intended and the ones you didn't. The Winchester name still exists, printed on rifles made in foreign factories by workers who never set foot in New Haven. The mystery house still stands, doors opening onto nothing, stairs climbing into ceilings. Frozen in the moment Sarah Winchester took her last breath, Oliver Winchester started with shirts and ended with an empire. William inherited that empire and died before he could run it. Annie never lived to see her first birthday. Sarah inherited everything and spent 38 years trying to give it away to ghosts who probably weren't there. The company that bore their name survived over a century, then collapsed under the weight of its own failures. The curse was never supernatural. It was just capitalism doing what capitalism does. Extract value. You concentrate wealth, externalize costs, move on when the extraction is complete. Leave others to clean up the mess. The doors to nowhere still stand in San Jose. The graves of a family that won an empire and lost everything lie scattered across the country. And somewhere, right now, someone is buying a rifle with Winchester stamped on the barrel, unaware that the name is just a ghost, a trademark attached to nothing, a memory of something that used to be real. The gun that won the West is still winning something, but it isn't America. It isn't progress. It isn't anything Oliver Winchester would have recognized. It's just money, flowing to shareholders of a corporation that has nothing to do with the family, the factory, or the strange, sad woman who tried to build her way to forgiveness. The curse continues. It just changed form.